Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. This is an amazing gathering. There are a lot of people in this room I've worked with in many efforts over many years. I wouldn't be here without a lot of the people in this room. Well, I would be here, but probably not as the New York State Attorney General. Baritone Lily Eskelson, Tammy Baldwin, Sheldon Whitehouse, Bill McKibben, Mayor Taveras. It's an honor to be here, and it's particularly great to be here with my friend Cecile Richards and my brothers and sisters from the pro-choice movement. I have people here I worked with when I was representing the defenders of New York State clinics when they were facing waves of violence and intimidation. There are people here I worked with on the issues of money and politics a decade ago, before we could ever anticipate Citizens United, when I was the president of New York Citizen Action. And friends from the marriage equality movement. We won a big victory in New York yesterday. A federal judge there added her voice to other jurists in declaring DOMA unconstitutional. And of course, you know, the Netroots community generally, you have helped me in every aspect of my work. More importantly, you've proven the power of regular people to fight and win through online investigation, reporting, shining light on misconduct, breaking new ground in organization building and communication. I want to close tonight's session by talking a little bit about movement building, because at the end of the day, everything we've heard here, to me, any significant progress, any really true change requires a movement. And I have two central points to make. The first is simple. Public leaders and public officials do not create movements. Movements create leaders. And the second is that movement politics always has to keep one eye on long-term transformational change. We have to fight the battles of today, but we have to keep our eye on changing people's consciousness to open them to possibilities for the long term. So first, long-term movements, by their very nature, have lots of leaders. They always emerge from grassroots activism. A lot of people here are movement builders, and I'm very familiar with the phenomenon of movement builders and grassroots activists starting movements and then public officials rushing in at the end to try and take credit. I hope you join me in rejecting the so-called great man theory of history that gives politicians much too much credit for social progress. So, speaking candidly, our civic and political officials are inherently inclined towards caution. They move when movements push them. Frankly, I believe we get from our elected officials what we make them give us, and that is true of our friends as well as our opponents. So I want to remind you that we had a century before 1980 in the United States when there were a series of great progressive movements that made us the nation with the most equitable distribution of wealth in the world. Our society, however imperfect, was steadily moving towards greater inclusion and moving away from the cruel compartmentalization of naked prejudice. And if you look at the history, the labor movement, the movement for women's rights, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, all began with activists and all ended with public officials trying to run to the front of the parade. You lead, and your elected representatives will follow. Now, this is equally true of our opponents, and we need to acknowledge, as I think people have already here, but, you know, to a certain extent, we've got to be candid and give it up to the movement conservatives for their work over the last 30 years. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, a stronger, more radical conservative movement came of age, and this movement, started again by activists, this movement, not Reagan or Gingrich or Bush, is what has derailed our century of progress towards the essential American ideal of equal justice, under law. I'm here, and I hope you are here, because I know we have both the ability and the responsibility to do something about it. So, thank you. Thank you. We're getting to them. But I appreciate people paying such close attention to my point about pushing elected officials. I'm not different than anyone else, you know? We all need support, you know? Sometimes we view it as tough love, but we all need to support our friends to do the right thing. Let me just finish off the point about public officials by reading you a couple of quotes that tell you everything you need to know. Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, after meeting with a group of labor activists, Sidney Hillman and others, who proposed a very ambitious series of initiatives, said, quote, "I agree with you, I want to do it, now make me do it." And then, to give equal time to the other side, and to the extent you ever had any doubt about who's running things in the contemporary conservative movement, earlier this year, Grover Norquist, speaking of the Republican candidates for president, said the following, quote, "We are not auditioning for fearless leader. We don't need a president to tell us in what direction to go. We know what direction to go. We just need a president to sign this stuff," close quote. That's how much they think of their candidates. Maybe Mitt is the perfect candidate for these guys. So take it from Franklin and Grover and me, when you build a movement, your leaders will follow. My second point, and my central point really about movement building, is the need to focus on long-term change. As many people have said tonight, there are many battles. The struggle that we're in now, and I really do think that we're in a unique position to build a movement for economic justice at this moment in American history, but the struggles that we face every day, single election campaign, single lawsuit, a single legislative fight, those aren't movements. Those are produced successfully by movements. A movement has to be focused on transforming the way people think over the long term to open the door so that the impossible becomes possible. I wrote an article for The Nation a few years ago making the distinction between what I call transformational and transactional politics, and we all need to do both. Transactional politics is very straightforward. What's the best deal I can get on a financial reform bill right now? What do I have to do to elect Democrats to the House and Senate this November? Transactional politics requires us to be pragmatic, focus about the here and now, the current state of public opinion. It's all about getting the best results possible given the circumstances today. Transformational politics is the work we do today to ensure the deal we can get on a jobs or financial reform or universal health care bill in a year or 5 years or 20 years will be better than the deal we can get today. We can never neglect the work of changing the narrative, of dealing with how people make assumptions that either permit or block our ability to move legislation, to bring lawsuits, to win elections. It requires us to reshape the assumptions about politics or economics, and actually, most centrally, about human nature that prevent people from embracing policies that will make their lives better. Let us never lose sight of the fact that the greatest damage done by the contemporary conservative movement was not any law they passed. It was in the transformation of the consciousness of millions of Americans that led them to embrace policies that hurt them. And you all know this, but it's important to focus on the success of this movement and give due respect to their transformational work. Over the last 30 years, they have convinced millions of voters that government is always less efficient than the private sector. They have sold the lie that cutting taxes on and regulation of the powerful creates broad-based economic growth. They convince people that unions, the institutions that created the American middle class, are bad for the American middle class. And perhaps most despicably to me, they convinced America, the land of the free, that our public safety depends on the mass incarceration of millions of young Black and Latino men. Well, the conservative movement hit a problem a few years ago. Same problem they hit in 1929. They had so much success with their crazy extremist anti-regulatory policies that they blew up the economy. They also got us into a bunch of wars it was very hard to get out of, but my focus tonight is really on economic justice because I think we have a unique opportunity right now to do movement building on that issue. Most Americans understand that. Most Americans want a response. As I travel around, I believe that the American people are asking for a change in the way we talk and think about our economic life in a society of growing inequality. People get that there's growing inequality, and people do want to get back to our national tradition of reaching for greater equity with each generation. You know who else knows this? Who else knows that this is a moment when we could be doing something big, when people are ready for a transformation towards equality, towards justice? The conservatives know this. So listen to this statement. At the end of 2008, in a painful concession that a massive federal bailout of our financial services sector was inevitable, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal stated, quote, "Anyone who thinks capitalism would fare better after a crash should recall that the 1930s did not end politically until 1980. They know the American people are at the point where we could have a second New Deal. They get it. It's time for us to get it. As in the 30s, we have the opportunity. Our predecessors, the reformers of that era did, they used the last demonstration of the fundamental fallacies of conservative economic ideology to make the United States, to transform the United States into a far more equitable, educated, healthy, and compassionate country. So, in keeping with the transformational theme, the most important thing about the New Deal, the reason its influence stretched from Roosevelt to Reagan and beyond, was that its architects did not view it as a list of regulations or public works projects. They recognized that their most significant work was in transforming America's basic sense of our collective life and our understanding of the role of government in creating wealth and poverty. The American people embraced the idea that we are in this together, that I do better when my neighbors do better, and our government is here to help ensure that we all move ahead together. It wasn't so long ago, but that's what Americans believed, and that's what they are ready to believe again. So we all know the history. The transformation of consciousness enabled us to enact laws and regulations that led to decades of strong economic growth where the benefits were shared far more broadly than they have been in recent decades. And this lasted until the resurgence of neoclassical supply-side nonsense that led to the greatest crash since 1929. But crisis creates opportunity. I want to talk now about a specific example, and I want to focus in on what happened last year from my perspective, because I think sometimes as you're caught up in day-to-day battles, you can sometimes miss the beginning of a transformational moment. And to me, 2011 was the opening for us to go ahead and start the transformational work, to have people see that we are all in this together and that it is time for a second New Deal. As many of you know, my office is investigating the bubble and crash in the mortgage market, and I have 3 goals. Thank you. And I have 3 goals for the investigations. First, accountability for those whose misconduct led to the crash. Second, meaningful help for homeowners and others who were hurt by this misconduct. And third, to help get everything out in the open so the other side can't rewrite history. Now, the third goal gets to this, the heart of fighting against the conservative transformational narrative that has undermined progressive public policy for so long. Almost immediately after the crash, There were people on Fox News saying that it happened because of too much regulation or because the government was trying to help poor people get homes they couldn't afford. And of course, after the crash, state and local governments went broke because of the recession. It was the direct result of the collapse of the markets. But the movement conservatives quickly got out there saying that our deficits are the result of spending too much on teachers or police or firefighters. Now, I can't comment in any detail on an ongoing investigation, but I assure you we have found no evidence that teachers or cops or firefighters or any other public employees blew up the American economy. In fact, I think we do have a pretty good idea of what happened. An extraordinary period of reckless deregulation set the stage for irresponsible and in some cases illegal conduct that led to an enormous housing bubble and an equally enormous crash. There's a record of this that everyone knows. They refused to regulate derivatives. They changed the risk rating system in 2001 so banks didn't have to set aside as much money in case of mortgage defaults. The worst for me, and those of us who work in state government, was in 2004 when the federal government not only refused to regulate predatory lending, they preempted the states. They actually prohibited all of us from trying to do anything about national banks engaging in predatory lending. So each of these legal and regulatory victories was a transactional victory, but they were only made possible by the decades of transformational work that led people to believe that this neoclassical economic philosophy of you're on your own, this idea that there's a natural state of markets, apparently, according to them, in which there are massive inequities in wealth, that seems to be what they perceive as natural, people were convinced that that was okay, that was like an immutable law. The conservatives act like there's some pages of Genesis the rest of us missed, you know? It's sort of like, and the sixth day God said there must be separate tax rates for capital gains and carried interest. There's, you know, in Leviticus it says you shall not eat shrimp and you shall not regulate derivatives. Look, this crash, this bubble, this inequity we're experiencing now, this lack of justice we're experiencing now, this wasn't created by God. This wasn't created by nature. This is a man-made catastrophe. We have to call them out for it, and we have to do what the people are asking us to do and move back towards the American tradition. So here's what I saw happen last year. And again, I think that people have to appreciate how dramatic it was from my point of view. I became Attorney General right after the crash and quickly began to understand this path of destruction that the supply-siders had blazed through our regulatory system. And then I learned that all of the other attorneys general and some federal agencies were negotiating a settlement with the largest banks over abuses in foreclosure practices. And to me, the deal on the table was clearly inadequate. It became clear to me, talking to people on the other side, that what the banks wanted in exchange for a relatively narrow agreement was a broad release for virtually all their misconduct, including stuff that hadn't been investigated, including conduct that I think led to the crash of the economy. So I refused to go along, and for a while I was really pretty isolated. There were a few AGs, Beau Biden from Delaware in particular, who saw things my way. But, you know, Attorney General Biden and I yesterday won a big victory on this front when the court ruled that they have to let us intervene in the major case in which a bank is trying to settle its claims with its investors, the Bank of America litigation in New York. So Beau and I are in there representing the people. So last summer I was kind of isolated, and then something happened. Occupy Wall Street exploded onto the scene and gave voice to a demand for accountability that changed the political landscape. And Occupy, this is very important. I travel around talking to people all over New York State. There are all these people who would never think of going to Zuccotti Park who said the same thing that Occupy was saying. We want accountability. We want equal justice under law. And lo and behold, the national debate changed. And support for my position, holding out for a narrow release and a broader investigation, began to grow. From labor unions, the AFL-CIO, SEIU, Unite Here, housing advocates like the Center for Responsible Lending, Netroots groups, including Move On, Progressive Campaign Change Committee, Credo, and civil rights organizations. Everyone started to weigh in. Dozens of other groups, progressive members of Congress got involved. Tammy Baldwin introduced a resolution supporting us. And because of this transformational work, because of this incredible public outcry, you all led to politicians all over America putting inequality back on the national agenda, putting accountability back on the national agenda. And that was the work that enabled us to narrow the release and get a better deal. And it was your work, I'm confident, that led to President Obama standing up at the State of the Union address in January and saying, everyone deserves a fair shot. Everyone should pay their fair share. There has to be one set of rules for everyone. That's the president. It didn't happen because he got a new speechwriter. It happened because the agenda had changed. And I think that my impression is that he's feeling it, and he backed up his words by dedicating more resources than they ever had and creating this task force that I'm co-chairing and pushing for faster action. But listen, everyone here tonight has said this fight is not over, this fight has just begun, but I want you to appreciate what an extraordinary moment we're in. Last year was the beginning of what I believe is a change in people's fundamental attitude about our willingness to accept inequality, about our willingness to accept injustice. And we didn't end up with an unstable, deregulated financial sector overnight, and we're not going to change it overnight. But ladies and gentlemen, my friends, my colleagues, if we keep pushing, if we keep organizing, if we look at the movement conservatives, right? Progressives have a tendency, you elect someone and then you go home. The conservatives never go home. They're there kicking their own guys in the back saying, come on, build the movement, do more of what we want. Come on, let's learn from our mistakes. Keep pushing, keep fighting. I am committed for the long haul to the transformational work to bring us back to the point where we can have a second New Deal. Are you in? So thank you. Thank you for pushing me. Thank you for pushing the president. Thank you for enabling those of us who want to reach back for the quintessential American vision of ever greater equity, ever greater justice with each generation. We can do it again. I assure you, the people are ahead of the politicians. You are ahead of both. But the communications work you do, the investigative work you do, the exposure of misconduct that you do is central to this effort. Let's do the transformational work. Let's get America back on track. Let's have the second New Deal. Thank you very much.